The restaurant, the Gilded Sparrow, hummed with the symphony of a life Eliza had only read about. It wasn't the boisterous noise of a pub, but a refined melody of hushed conversations, the distant chime of a wine glass, and the whisper of silver against porcelain. Candlelight danced in the heart of each table, casting long, dramatic shadows across rich mahogany booths and crisp, navy blue linens. It was a world away from her own, and easily the most elegant place Eliza had ever set foot in. She pushed open the heavy oak door, and a tiny, insistent bell overhead announced her arrival, like a spotlight she hadn't asked for. Her hands immediately went to the sides of her dress, tracing the delicate seams of the ivory silk. It was a vintage piece, a treasure that had belonged to her mother, with a fitted waist that still held its form, though the hem was beginning to betray its age with a gentle fraying. It was a silent prayer woven into the fabric. She had worn it only once before, a decade ago, on the day she clutched her college diploma. Tonight, it was both her armor and her last shred of hope. In her small apartment that afternoon, she had painstakingly curled her golden hair and applied the little makeup the last of her paycheck could afford. Her lips were painted a hopeful shade of rose, but the nervous pulse fluttering in her throat wore no disguise. Her reflection in the window had shown a stranger, a woman pretending to belong. A hostess with an impeccable, practiced smile glided towards her. "Reservation for Eliza," she managed, her voice barely trembling. A small victory. "Of course. Right this way." Eliza followed the hostess to a small table tucked into a quiet alcove by the window. The lamp above cast a warm, isolated glow upon the white tablecloth, like a stage light waiting for the curtain to rise on her life or for it to fall. Eliza sank into the plush velvet chair, her worn leather purse, containing nearly her last dollar, held tightly in her lap. A glance at her phone confirmed it. 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes early. It gave her a moment to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. Please, let this be the one. Let him be different. Her gaze flitted past the silhouettes of other couples, their easy laughter a stark contrast to her own coiled tension, before inevitably landing back on the entrance. She had swiped right on a handsome face and a promising profile, a digital gamble that had led her here. His name was Leo. On the app, he had seemed like a safe harbor, kind, thoughtful, and refreshingly not pushy. His messages were concise, yet they held a warmth that had slowly chipped away at the wall she had built around her heart. When he'd suggested the Gilded Sparrow, a deep-seated panic had flared, but she'd extinguished it and said yes. It had taken her months to agree to a date with anyone. Years, if she were being brutally honest with herself. At a corner table, separated from hers by a sea of quiet conversations, a man in a flawless charcoal suit swirled a glass of amber scotch. Julian Vance had come here to decompress after a boardroom battle, seeking the quiet anonymity of the evening crowd. The tension of his day, however, had dissolved the moment he saw her. His gaze, often sharp and analytical, softened as he watched the young woman by the window. She had entered carrying her hope like a fragile flame, her every movement betraying a nervous vulnerability. Something about her pierced through his cynicism, reminding him of a time long past, before experience had taught him that love was often just another transaction. 15 minutes crawled by, then 30. The clock on the wall felt like a silent judge. Eliza shifted in the velvet chair, the fabric now feeling less like a luxury and more like a trap. She checked her phone again, the screen's bright light a stark contrast to the dim hope in her heart. No new messages. Her thumb scrolled up to the last one he had sent that afternoon. "Can't wait to see you tonight." She read the words like an incantation, willing them to still be true. At 7:15, her hope dwindling, she sent a quick message. "Hey, I'm here. Just checking in." It was a lifeline thrown into a silent ocean. Still nothing. Each time the heavy oak door opened, her head would snap up, a fresh jolt of adrenaline followed by a sharp, bitter sting of disappointment. She tried to stop her hands from shredding her cocktail napkin. At 7:30, she surrendered to her last resort and called. It rang once before being swallowed by the cold, digital finality of voicemail. A server approached her table, his presence an unwelcome interruption of her private grief. "Miss, would you like to go ahead and order something to drink while you wait?" Eliza blinked, pulled from her thoughts. "Oh," she started, her voice brittle. "No, thank you. I'm sure he'll be here any second." The server gave a polite, knowing nod and retreated. With trembling fingers, Eliza fumbled with the clasp of her small purse. Inside, nestled in a side pocket, was a single, worn and creased $5 bill. It was her talisman against total disaster. She hadn't dared to even open the menu, knowing a simple glass of iced tea would cost more than that. The entire foundation for the evening had been built on the fragile hope that he would arrive and warmly say, "What are we having tonight?" She had prayed for something more than this suffocating silence. As if on cue, her phone vibrated against the table, a sudden, jarring buzz. A message from Leo, a final. Foolish surge of hope flared as she opened it. The words on the screen were stark and cruel. "LOL, you're actually there. I was just killing time. Sorry, but you're not really my type." A second message popped up before she could even process the first. "No offense, but definitely not worth the Uber fare." The screen blurred, not with tears, but with a haze of disbelief and sharp, blinding shame. The air rushed from her lungs. Her jaw tightened, a painful ache spreading to her temples. All the sounds of the restaurant, the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, dissolved into a dull, roaring static in her ears. She refused to cry. She would not give him that. Not here, not in a room full of strangers. She would not shatter. From his table, Julian saw the exact moment the light went out in her eyes. He hadn't seen the words on her phone, but he didn't need to. He saw the faint blush of hope on her cheeks vanish, leaving her skin pale and translucent under the soft light. He saw the way she locked her spine straight, a rod of pure, defiant pride holding together something that was threatening to splinter apart. He recognized it instantly, the quiet, desperate bravado of the publicly humiliated. He had worn that same invisible armor once, long ago, in her shattered composure. He saw the ghost of a younger, hungrier version of himself, standing on a different doorstep, holding a different foolish hope. He watched as Eliza sat perfectly still, her face a pale mask, her eyes glassy but dry. There was a tightness in her posture that screamed a desire to dematerialize, to fold herself into nothing and escape into the shadows between floorboards. He had finished his scotch 20 minutes ago and had no reason to stay. But Julian found he couldn't leave. He was no longer just an observer. He was a witness, and something primal and protective inside him refused to let him walk away and leave her to drown in the silence. He saw the exact moment the fight left her. The fragile bravery she had worn like armor was gone, replaced by the quiet, indelible bruise of disappointment. He watched her hand press gently against her stomach, a small, unconscious gesture that told him everything. She had been nursing a single glass of water for over an hour. The equation was simple and painful. She was hungry. Her eyes darted towards the hostess stand, a flicker of panic in them as she calculated how long she could linger before being asked to leave. With a deep, nearly invisible breath, she reached for her coat, gathering the last of her dignity. She stood, each movement slow and heavy as if the air itself were resisting her escape, her purse clutched in her hand. She turned toward the door. Just as she took her first hesitant step, a server materialized at her side, a gentle but impassable barrier. On the tray he held was a steaming plate of pasta, fragrant with garlic and basil, alongside a tall glass of sparkling lemonade with fresh mint. "Excuse me, miss," the server said kindly. "Your dinner?" Eliza blinked, utterly bewildered. I think there's a mistake. I didn't order anything." A wave of ice-cold dread washed over her. Was this another layer to the cruelty? A final, public joke at her expense? "It was ordered for you," the server explained, "and your entire tab has been settled." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the room, searching for the source of this new torment. Then a voice spoke from just behind her, calm and deep, cutting to the static in her mind. "It's not a joke," Julian said, answering the terrified question in her eyes. "And it's not charity. It's dinner." Eliza spun around, startled. Julian Vance was standing by his table, one hand resting on the back of his chair. His expression was impossible to read, but his eyes held a steady, unnerving honesty. He wasn't offering pity. He wasn't trying to impress her. For the first time all night, she felt something other than invisible or foolish. She felt seen. Before she could form a reply, he moved with a fluid, decisive motion, pulling out the chair opposite her at her own table and sitting down. The silence stretched for a moment, thick with unspoken questions. Then he looked at her, his gaze direct. "Please sit," he said, his voice softer now. No one should have to face a battlefield on an empty stomach. Eliza stared at him, the unexpected words disarming her completely. It wasn't a line. It wasn't an advance. It was impossibly the simple truth. Slowly, she sank back into the chair, as if for the first time all night, someone had just offered her solid ground. No one had ever spoken to her with such quiet force. The words landed not like a compliment, but like a fact she had long forgotten. She looked from his face down to the plate of food, a perfect, beautiful meal she couldn't possibly deserve. Her hands remained knotted in her lap. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," he replied, his voice even. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or heavy. For the first time all evening, it felt honest, a space for her to simply breathe. Eliza risked another glance at him. He was a man sculpted from a different world than hers, the kind of man she saw in magazines. Never across a table. The cut of his suit was impeccable, his watch an understated masterpiece of engineering. But it was his face that held her captive. It was calm, intently curious, and held no trace of pity. She cleared her throat, her pride demanding she not be seen as a charity case. "You know nothing about me." "True," Julian agreed, not missing a beat. "But I know what matters." She couldn't stop herself from asking, her voice barely a whisper. "And what is that exactly?" He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, creating an intimate space just for the two of them. "I saw someone who walked in here wearing her hope like armor. I saw someone who waited with far more grace than her date deserved, only to be met with casual cruelty. And I saw that even then, you chose dignity over despair." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "In this world, Eliza, that isn't just something. That's everything." A sharp, hot sting pricked the back of her eyes. All her life, her softness, her relentless hope had been framed as a fatal flaw. She was a naive one, the girl who trusted too easily. But this stranger, this man with eyes that saw far too much, had just defined it as her greatest strength. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she finally lifted her fork. The first bite of pasta was warm and grounding, a tether back to the real world. It was the first proper meal she'd had in days. Julian watched her for only a moment before leaning back, giving her space. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his tone shifting from intense to gentle. "I didn't mean to interfere." He hesitated, as if deciding whether to say more, but I couldn't walk away. "I recognize the hope in your eyes. It's a look I used to wear myself a long time ago." Eliza looked up from her plate, her fork frozen midair, suddenly seeing not just a benefactor, but a man with a history written in the lines around his eyes. With her fork still hovering over her plate, she asked, "And who was that person you used to be?" A faint, melancholic smile touched his lips. A young man who was convinced he had to build an empire before he was worthy of a single glance. His words settled in the space between them, and something unspoken passed. A flicker of mutual understanding, a recognition of the lonely fear of not being enough. In that moment, the vast, invisible chasm between her world and his seemed to close. She still fell out of place in the elegant restaurant, but with him sitting there, she was no longer a ghost at the feast. She was simply a woman having dinner. The rest of the meal passed in a quiet, comfortable blur. He didn't pry or ask invasive questions. Instead, he asked about the books she was studying, the dreams she held for a life beyond her tiny apartment. When it was finally time to leave, Julian stood, and as he helped her with her coat, he discreetly placed a small, heavy stock card in her hand. It wasn't a business card. "There's a cafe near the university, the Daily Grind," he said, his voice low. "The coffee is much better than what they serve in the library. It's on me whenever you like." He gave a small nod, a gesture of understanding more than farewell. "Good night, Eliza." And then he was gone. A week passed in a monotone of textbooks, part-time shifts at the library, and a careful calculus of a dwindling grocery budget. Eliza tried to file the evening away as a strange, beautiful anomaly, but the memory of it was a secret warmth she carried with her. He hadn't pitied her. He had respected her. He hadn't tried to save her. He had simply offered her a meal and a moment of dignity, asking for nothing in return. It was a kindness so profound it had unsettled her world. On a crisp Thursday morning, after a particularly grueling night of studying, she found a card in her coat pocket. On a sudden impulse, she skipped the library and walked the extra 6 blocks to find the Daily Grind. It was a warm, bustling place that smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. She was standing at the counter, fumbling in her worn coin purse and mentally calculating if she could afford a small black coffee, when a familiar, calm voice cut through the morning rush from behind her. "Add a croissant to that," Julian said to the barista, "and put it all on my tab." Eliza froze, then turned slowly. He was there not in a suit, but a simple gray sweater, looking completely at home. He offered a small, genuine smile. "I had a feeling you might show up today." Eliza turned fully, stunned to see him settled in a corner booth as if he owned the place. His laptop was open and his sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing a familiar, expensive watch. He had the same calm smile on his face. "You remembered my name," she said softly, her voice filled with disbelief as she accepted the warm cup and croissant from him. "Eliza." "Of course," he replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Though it was your composure under fire that was truly memorable." She blinked, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. She slid into the seat opposite him, and for a moment, they sat in a comfortable quiet. The morning sun streamed to the large front window, painting golden streaks across the worn wooden table. The air, rich with the smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee, felt like a sanctuary. "Do you work around here?" she asked, breaking the silence. It was the first normal question she'd ever asked him. He nodded, gesturing vaguely with his cup. "My office is downtown, but this place has the best coffee and the fewest distractions. Usually." Noticing the conversation stalling, Julian leaned back. "You know," he said, his tone shifting to something more conspiratorial, "we almost destroyed a brand last quarter." He paused. "We launched a new line of organic toddler snacks, Broccoli Bites. The marketing slogan ended up translating in one of our biggest markets to bitter green rocks for your baby. It was a disaster." A sudden, bright laugh escaped Eliza's lips, surprising them both. He continued, sharing how a famous food blogger had posted a viral video of her golden retriever refusing to eat one. He recounted the entire fiasco not with the embarrassment of a CEO, but with the easy humor of someone who had learned that failure was just another part of the job. And in that moment, Eliza finally truly relaxed. There was no pity in his eyes, no awkward questions about that horrible night. He wasn't the powerful man from the restaurant. He was just Julian, a person telling a funny story about screwing up at work. She took a sip of her coffee, the warmth chasing away the last of her tension. That slogan sounds like something my anatomy professor would come up with. He grinned, a genuine, unguarded expression. "I could use someone with that kind of brutal honesty in my marketing department." She raised a skeptical eyebrow. "I'm a broke nursing student who counts pennies for coffee. I know nothing about branding." "Exactly," Julian said, his expression turning serious again, though his eyes were kind. "You see people, not demographics. That's a much rarer and far more valuable skill." They talked for another hour, about the merits of dark roast versus light roast, about the universal tragedy of a bad childhood haircut, about the simple joy of finding a quiet place to read. The ease of the conversation, the simple, unburdened lightness of it, was a feeling so foreign and wonderful that Eliza wanted to bottle it. When she finally stood to leave for her class, she braced herself for the inevitable invitation or the request for her number. Instead, Julian simply smiled. "Have a good class, Eliza." He let her go without a single string attached. His lack of pressure was, in itself, the most profound gesture he could have made. As she walked down the sunlit street, a genuine, unforced smile bloomed on her face. A sense of buoyancy lifted her steps. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she had shared a table with a man not out of desperate hope for a connection, but out of a simple, mutual choice to share a moment. The first night, a stranger had tried to buy her dinner. This morning, a man had bought her coffee. One felt like a transaction, the other a conversation. And that, she realized, made all the difference. 2 weeks later, Eliza sat a few rows in the front in a sleek but understated focus group room. A screen at the front displayed colorful slides of smiling babies and cartoon carrots. At the back of the room, a table was laden with samples, fruit purees, teething crackers, and organic juices, all bearing the clean, elegant logo of a company called Oro Organics. She clutched a notepad in her lap, her pen poised. She wore her pale blue nursing scrubs under a simple gray cardigan, her hair pulled back neatly. She was a clear outlier amongst the other attendees, polished mommy bloggers, a few pediatric nutritionists, and other young mothers. Attending events like this was a luxury she could never afford, but a text from Julian a week prior had removed the barrier. "We're hosting a small panel on nutritional integrity. Thought it might align with your studies. Fee is waived, of course. No pressure." So she had come, curious to see what his world looked like in the light of day. The presenter, a cheerful woman in a lab coat, introduced the topic: navigating the modern pantry, food safety and allergen awareness in infant foods. As the presentation progressed, Eliza's professional focus took over. During the Q&A, her hand was one of the first to go up. She asked a sharp question about the specific type of probiotics used in their yogurt melts, then followed up with a polite but firm observation about a potential cross-contamination risk in their gluten-free oat processing. pointing out a discrepancy between their packaging and current FDA guidelines. Both times, the presenter, a woman with decades of experience in the field, paused. "That's an excellent question," she said after the first one. After the second, she simply nodded, impressed, and a very sharp observation. Standing near the back of the room in a crisp navy blazer, Julian watched quietly. He had seen countless ambitious interns and sharp-witted employees try to make a name for themselves. But Eliza's voice was different. It held an unadorned authority. She wasn't trying to score points. She was simply, deeply trying to understand. She asked questions like someone who would one day be responsible for saving a life. When the panel concluded, the room buzzed with networking. Business cards were exchanged over mini quiches. Eliza, however, slipped out a side door unnoticed. Her mission was accomplished. She had learned something. Now, it was time to get back to work. She headed for her sanctuary down the block. The public library was her favorite place in the city, tucked between two towering glass office buildings. It had a quiet study room on the second floor with a large window overlooking a tiny, walled-in garden. She'd always thought of it as a secret garden for minds in bloom, a place for people quietly trying to grow. The last person she expected to see in her sanctuary was Julian. Yet there he was, standing near the colorful chaos of the children's reading nook. And he was not alone. His hand rested on the shoulder of a small girl in a bright yellow sweater dress, her dark hair in two tiny pigtails. Eliza froze in the doorway. Julian looked up, and for the first time, she saw him look genuinely flustered. A faint flush rose on his neck. "Eliza," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She recovered first. "Just returning some books," she said, holding up her stack. Her gaze drifted to the little girl peering from behind his legs. "This," he said, his voice dropping with a gentle reverence, "is Lily, my daughter." Eliza's eyebrows lifted in surprise. A daughter. The word recalibrated everything she thought she knew about him. He seemed to read her expression. "She's 3, he explained carefully, a little shy with new people." Eliza instinctively crouched down to her level, offering a small, warm smile that didn't feel forced at all. "Hi, Lily. I love your dress." The girl blinked up at her with large, curious brown eyes. After a long moment, she slowly stepped forward. Her tiny hand reached out and gently touched the sleeve of Eliza's cardigan. "You're pretty," Lily announced to no one in particular. A light, genuine laugh escaped Eliza's lips. Eliza smiled back. "You're very pretty, too." There was a quiet pause. Then Lily leaned in close, her small nose twitching as she sniffed the sleeve of Eliza's cardigan. In a conspiratorial whisper, she said, "You smell like Mommy." The air in the quiet library seemed to shatter. Julian's expression froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was a silence filled with the ghost of a memory. Eliza remained perfectly still, the immense weight of the child's innocent words pressing down on the space between them. She glanced at Julian. His face was a mask, but the hand gripping Lily's shoulder trembled almost imperceptibly. Eliza knelt again, her eyes level with the child's. Her voice was a soft balm. "Then your mommy must have smelled wonderful," she said gently. "Like kindness." Lily nodded, a solemn, certain expression on her face. Julian turned his head away, the hard line of his jaw betraying the immense effort of his composure. He blinked twice, then cleared his throat. "Okay, sweet pea," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's go find that book about the bear." As Lily scampered off toward the picture books, Julian remained for a moment, his gaze distant. He finally turned back to Eliza. "My wife," he said, the words quiet and raw. "She passed away 2 years ago." He swallowed hard. Lily, she never says things like that. Eliza nodded, her heart aching for this man and his little girl. "Sense and feelings," she said softly. "Children remember those with their hearts, long after their heads forget the details." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, the guard in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a raw, open vulnerability. Their new routine began not with a business proposal, but with that shared, fragile moment in the library. Eliza started stopping by Julian's office once a week, initially just to drop off freshly annotated research documents on child nutrition that he had started sending her. Soon, she was staying longer, sipping a cup of tea he'd have waiting for her while she reviewed marketing briefs and product labels. She had an uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies, to ask the simple, human questions that his team of experts often overlooked. Julian found he valued her insight more than any of the high-priced consultants he had on retainer. But he was beginning to realize with a feeling that both thrilled and terrified him, that it was never just about the work. It was the quiet, grounding nature of her presence that he began to crave. Their arrangement evolved organically. It started one frantic Tuesday when his nanny had a family emergency. Julian called Eliza, his voice tight with panic, not as a boss demanding a favor, but as a friend reaching for a lifeline. Eliza's effect on Lily was immediate and calming. Soon it became their routine. On days the nanny was unavailable, Eliza would pick Lily up from preschool. They developed their own sacred rituals. The scent of her lavender soap, the careful way she braided Lily's hair, and the non-negotiable two-book rule before bed. They never spoke of their pasts. Those were islands they hadn't yet built bridges to. There were no declarations, no grand romantic overtures, just a collection of small, stolen moments. But when Eliza would laugh at something silly Lily said, Julian would find himself watching her, a forgotten warmth spreading through his chest. Late at night, after a long day, he'd find his thumb hovering over her name in his contacts. The impulse to share a small piece of his day wore with the instinct to protect the fragile piece she had brought into their lives. Then one Thursday afternoon, the unspoken line between their arrangement and something more finally dissolved. Lily had a low-grade fever, and Julian had been home all day, trapped in a cacophony of a sick child's whines and the incessant chime of work emails. He was a CEO who could command a boardroom, but he was completely overwhelmed. At 4:30, there was a soft but certain knock on the door. It was Eliza, a small canvas tote bag in her hand. "I heard her in the background of our call earlier," she said simply. "I thought you might need an extra pair of hands." A wave of profound relief washed over him as he let her in. The house, usually immaculate, was a mess of discarded tissues and half-empty glasses of water. Lily lay on the couch, small and miserable under a thin blanket, her cheeks flushed with fever. Her eyes fluttered open when Eliza approached, and she reached out a small, weak hand without a word. Eliza sat on the edge of the sofa, her movements practiced and sure, and ran a cool hand across Lily's forehead before pulling something from her bag. A soft cloth compress, wrapped in wax paper to keep it cool and damp. "It's an old nursing trick," Eliza said quietly, her voice a balm in the tense room. "A little lavender for the head and chamomile for the heart." Julian watched, frozen in place, as she gently pressed cloth to Lily's forehead. His daughter let out a soft, contented sigh, and her tense little body relaxed into the cushions. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by Eliza humming a soft, wordless lullaby as she stroked Lily's hair. Then, the humming coalesced into words, sung so softly it was almost just a breath in the quiet room. Julian went utterly still. He knew that song. He hadn't heard it in 3 years, not since the last time his wife had sung it. It was their own silly, secret lullaby, a melody from an old folk tune they had repurposed with their own nonsense lyrics for Lily, a song that belonged only to the three of them. And then Eliza sang the line, her voice a gentle caress in the dim light. "The moon wears socks when it's cold at night." The strength fled from Julian's body. His knees buckled, and he sank silently into a large armchair behind her. He didn't make a sound, but after years of stoic control and carefully managed grief, the tears finally came, a silent, violent torrent he was powerless to stop. He buried his face in his hands as his shoulders shook. Across the room, Eliza's voice trembled for a fraction of a second as she felt the shift in the air, but she kept singing, holding the melody steady for him, a quiet anchor in his storm of memory. When the last note faded, she looked over her shoulder. Julian was still bent forward, his face in his hands. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He shook his head, not looking up. "How could you have?" A long, raw silence stretched between them. "It was our song," he finally said, his voice a hoarse rasp. I thought Lily had forgotten it." Eliza looked down at the little girl, now sleeping peacefully in the circle of her arms, a stark contrast to the father who was quietly coming undone nearby. "Children don't forget love, Julian," she said softly. "They just store away and wait to hear it again." He finally looked up, his face wrecked with grief and a dawning sense of wonder. They sat that way for a long time, a silent tableau in the dim light. One man, one woman, and a sleeping child, not naming what they were becoming, but feeling it settle in the quiet spaces of the house. In the weeks that followed, the fragile intimacy of that evening became the new foundation of their lives. A quiet rhythm of work, study, and shared dinners took hold. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. It came in a plain white envelope, the formal letterhead of the National Nursing Scholarship Foundation, printed neatly in the top left corner. Eliza stared at it for a full 5 minutes, her heart hammering against her ribs before she finally tore it open with shaking hands. She read the first sentence, then the second, her mind struggling to catch up to the words on the page. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, the paper trembling in her hand. Full tuition scholarship, 1-year pediatric nursing specialization program, out of state. It was a finish line she had been crawling towards for years, the culmination of 1,000 lonely nights spent with textbooks and instant coffee. It was everything she had ever wanted, but instead of the pure elation she expected, a hollow ache spread through her chest. This dream, her oldest and most cherished one, now meant abandoning a new one she hadn't even dared to name. It meant leaving the quiet warmth of Julian's kitchen in the morning, leaving the sweet weight of a sleeping Lily in her arms, leaving the strange, steady rhythm of something that felt impossibly like home. For 3 days, she carried a letter in her coat pocket, a secret joy and a secret sorrow folded together. She finally told him at the park. Lily was a joyful blur, chasing soap bubbles across the grass, while Eliza sat beside Julian on a bench. "I got the scholarship," she said, the words barely a whisper. Julian turned to her, his smile immediate and brilliant, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Eliza, that's magnificent." She nodded, unable to look at him, her gaze fixed on a crack in the pavement. "It's in Seattle," she added. "It's for a full year." The wind rustled the leaves around their feet. Julian was quiet for a long, heavy moment. Then, his voice steady despite the effort, he said, "Then you have to go." Her head snapped up, her eyes searching as for any hint of resentment or disappointment. She had to ask, had to voice the ugly fear that had been haunting her. "What if you think I'm just leaving?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That I was just using you, and this, for a place to land before taking off again?" His expression softened completely. He shook his head, a slow, certain movement. "Eliza," he said, his voice low and certain, "I've spent my life building things. The last thing I would ever do is build a beautiful cage for someone I care about." He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a painful honesty. "The whole point is for you to fly. It would be my honor to get to watch you do it." The words settled deep inside her, soothing the old, familiar fear of abandonment. In the bittersweet weeks that followed, they tried to memorize moments. The exact shade of the sunset from his balcony, the sound of Lily's laughter, the quiet comfort of just being in the same room. And then, all too quickly, early August arrived, not with a whisper, but with the roar of a jet engine, pulling her away. The night before her flight, Julian cooked dinner. They ate pasta by candlelight at Lily's insistence, and afterward, the three of them sat on the living room floor with colored paper and glue, meticulously crafting a long paper chain. "One link for every week you're gone," Lily explained with the utmost seriousness, "so we can count down until you come home." When it was finally time for Eliza to leave, she knelt to say her goodbyes. Before she could speak, Lily threw her small arms around her neck and hugged her tightly. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice full of a wisdom she had clearly borrowed. "Daddy says our hearts have invisible strings, so they don't care about airplanes." Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the little girl closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. It was a goodbye free from the ghosts of her past, one built not on fear, but on trust. She looked up at Julian, who stood by the door, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression a quiet, painful mix of pride and love. No promises were spoken, no pleas to wait, just a silent, profound understanding that what they had built was strong enough to survive the space between them. That night, Eliza cried, not from the sorrow of leaving, but from the overwhelming relief of being loved enough to be set free. A year later, she stood at the staff entrance to the community hospital. The walls were the same sterile white. The monitors beeped with the same soft urgency, and the nurses still moved with the same practice efficiency. But the world inside Eliza had been completely rebuilt. She clutched her new ID badge, the plastic cool against her fingertips. Beneath her name, in bold, clear letters, were the 2 words she had spent her life working for: registered nurse. She had done it, after a year of grueling coursework, sleepless nights, and an ache for home that was sharper than she'd ever imagined. She was back, stronger and more certain of herself than ever before. Her first morning passed in a blur of introductions and paperwork. Just before lunch, a charge nurse she remembered from her training days approached with a wide smile. "Glad to have you back, kiddo." She handed Eliza a sleek, heavy-stock envelope. "Big donor event in the new pediatric wing this afternoon. You're on the list." Eliza opened it, her brow furrowed in confusion. The invitation was simple and elegant, announcing the official launch of a new product line from Oro Organics. the First Bites collection. The invitation read, Aura Organics cordially invites you to a celebration of new beginnings. Location, the rooftop garden new pediatric wing. Time, 3 p.m. She knew instantly who it was from. At exactly 3 o'clock, Eliza stepped out of the hospital elevator and into an urban oasis, an airy rooftop garden lined with flowering herbs and soft, glowing lights. A long table in the center of the space displayed the new product line. The packaging was a soft, gentle green, the script elegant, the First Bites collection, and just beneath it, a small, powerful tagline, for the women who go hungry to feed hope. The words hit Eliza with the force of a physical blow. Her throat tightened as she looked closer at the design. The silhouette on the side of the box, a woman in a simple dress, her hair in a bun, offering a spoon to a small child, was unmistakably, achingly her. Julian was standing near a small podium, speaking to a crowd of donors and press. His voice was calm and professional, but when his eyes found hers across the rooftop, a slow, brilliant smile transformed his face. He finished his speech, shook 2 hands, and then walked directly to her, ignoring everyone else. I was hoping you'd be here, he said, his voice low. I wasn't sure you still remembered a broke nursing student's opinion on marketing, she replied, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. Impossible, he said, his eyes warm and full of a year's worth of unspoken conversation. Your opinion is the only one that ever mattered. They stood in a pocket of silence, the noise of the party fading away. Slowly, Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a grand declaration. He simply opened it, revealing a delicate ring with a single, clear sapphire the color of her eyes. Eliza, he said quietly, his voice full of emotion, you were never a damsel in distress. The hero of this story is the woman who walked into that restaurant a year ago and chose dignity over despair. He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. I'm not asking to save you. I'm asking if you'll let me stand beside you for all the days to come. She stared at the ring, then at his face, etched with the memory of his past, but softened by the promise of a future. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She simply nodded. It was a yes born not from need or fear, but from a place of profound peace. A choice made by 2 fractured souls who, in healing themselves, had found their way to each other. Later that week, the sough of a conversation and the clinking of glasses filled the same restaurant where a lonely young woman had once waited for a date who never came. But tonight, the table by the window wasn't set for 1. It was set for 3. For Julian, for a giggling Lily who was carefully drawing a family of stick figures on a napkin, and for Eliza. She was no longer nervous, no longer hopeful, no longer invisible. She was simply home. She walked into the Gilded Sparrow hand in hand with Julian, their fingers laced together with a comfortable, practiced ease. Lily trotted just ahead, her pigtails bouncing. The hostess greeted them with a genuine warmth that was absent on that first, lonely night. She led them to the familiar corner table by the window, but this time it was set for 3. Julian pulled out a chair for Eliza before helping Lily into hers. No longer separate, no longer an observer from afar, just one table, shared. Eliza looked around the room. The same soft candlelight, the same polished wood. She even recognized the server who had approached her with such gentle pity. It felt like a lifetime ago. Julian slid a menu in front of her with a tender smile. Order whatever you want, he said, his voice low. Tonight, we are celebrating the woman who sat at this table alone and never lost her dignity. A soft, breathy laugh escaped her, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She looked down at the menu, then back at him at the quiet love in his eyes. You remember all of that? He shook his head slightly. I remember you, he said simply. Just then, a triumphant Lily reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She spread it on the table with immense pride. It was a crayon drawing of a little house with the sun smiling down on it. At the center were 3 stick figures sitting at a dinner table. One was tall with dark hair, one was small with pigtails, and one had long, golden hair just like hers. This is us, Lily announced, and we're eating pasta, because Mommy Eliza loves pasta. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Mommy Eliza. The 2 words landed with a gentle, profound weight. She reached across the table and gently touched the waxy crayon drawing, her fingers trembling. Did you draw this today, sweet pea? She asked, her voice thick. Lily nodded enthusiastically. At preschool, my teacher told us to draw our very favorite thing in the whole world. So I drew having dinner with you and Daddy. Julian looked down at his daughter's masterpiece, then across the table at Eliza, his eyes full of everything words could never say. The past was healed. The future was here, drawn in crayon on a folded piece of paper. The candlelight gilded their faces. Laughter from a nearby table was a distant, happy echo. A waiter, moving with practiced grace, set down a basket of warm bread without breaking the spell that had fallen over their table. Eliza looked at the two people in front of her, the man who had seen her when she felt invisible, and the little girl who had, in a single crayon drawing, offered her a home. She took a slow sip of water, her gaze never leaving Julian's. Then she spoke, her voice not a dramatic declaration, but a quiet, certain truth that had taken her a year and a lifetime to understand. "You know," she whispered, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "That first night, you weren't late at all." His eyes questioned hers. "I just had to wait long enough for the right person to show up." Julian didn't need to speak. His answer was in the way he reached for her hand across the table, his fingers lacing with hers in a gesture that was both a comfort and a promise. Outside the window of the Gilded Sparrow, the city bustled on. But inside, at one small table set for three, a future had quietly begun. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue. Just three souls, a child's drawing, and a love story built not on a grand gesture, but on the simple, profound miracle of showing up,